Good evening for those of you for whom it is evening. This is Professor Aminah Al-Deen for Critical Talk, which is a production of Sound Vision and allied with Muslim Network TV. I want to say we're trying an experiment this evening, turning Critical Talk into a classroom where I have two expert guests, Professor Scott Hibbard, who we've met on this program before, who's the chair of political science at DePaul University in Chicago, and Professor Laith Saud, who is also a colleague of mine, who is a scholar and a writer and an author and just a good friend, but experts in their subject matter. We're doing this tonight because it has, from questions coming in on the chat and from the people we're talking to, we found out that many of us don't have enough of the basic facts to move ahead. So, in regard to that, I have asked Kamila Barbour, Miriam Tisdale, Shardil Khan, to join us as students, as if this were a classroom setting. We have some more students who may or may not make it, but you know how students are. In the beginning, what I would like to begin with is if I can ask that the map of what is at the crux, beside the treaties and broken promises and compromises, but let's look at a map of what the place looked like in 1940, wrong map, 1946. This area in green was Palestine. And I'm not quite sure what the areas in white were. They may have been multi religious sites, a little bit of it might have been where some Jewish settlers lived. When we get to 1947 and this infamous thing called the Balfour Declaration, which our professors are going to talk about, look at what happens. Palestine is shrunk. I can't even call that sizable. And if you notice, much like if we were to look at a map of India after the partition, you know, uh, one country is controlling the bulk of everything. By the time we get to 1949, between 1949 and 1967, you can see that that bottom part or the long part of the L that was Palestinian territory has now disappeared. The Gaza Strip is indeed a strip. And then there is the West Bank on the right hand side. This is where Jerusalem is and some other things. If you look to 2012, what do we see? Well, even that part that was Palestinian territory has now been encroached upon. I don't want to stay there because we got to get to information. I think that in 2020, you can see that Palestinians are being pushed what looks like south and eastward, but we're going to come back later to a map that shows you what is there, where they're being pushed to. I'm going to ask, it doesn't matter to me which professor starts first, an overview of the place.
Scott?
Okay. So you had asked earlier about the Balfour Declaration. I think probably the key element to understand that is if you look at that first part of the slide, talk about the British mandate. That towards the end of World War One or in the lead up to World War One, this was all part of Ottoman territory, and it was during the Ottoman times you began to see a migration of Jewish settlers from Europe into into the region. In the aftermath of World War One, towards the end of World War One, you have the British controlling that, what was then Palestine as well as Egypt, and they made a commitment to the Jewish population in Europe, which was the Balfour Declaration, which agreed in 1917. And it's a very carefully worded document, and it basically commits the British government to the establishment of a Jewish homeland in the area of Palestine. But it also commits the British government to protecting the indigenous rights of the existing populations. So essentially what's happening is the British are committing to the Arab populations that their rights will be protected, and committing to the Jewish population that they will support the creation of establishment of a homeland. Now, this is all happening within the context of World War One. They're promising much of the land of the region to the French through the Sykes-Picot Agreement. They're promising much of the land of the region, or they're promising the creation of an Arab state to Sharif Hussein through the Hussein-McMahon correspondence. And they're basically worried about losing World War One, and they're basically promising everything to everybody in order to ensure victory in World War One. World War One happens, and yeah. Sorry, you're muted, Aminah.
Aminah, we can't hear you.
Why are they trying? What is the reason for these promises?
So if you look at it from again, taking a step back in history, so if you look at it from the Jewish perspective, the Jewish population of Europe was a historically marginalized and persecuted minority throughout the region, throughout Europe,
right,
living as in a diaspora. And the Zionist movement comes out of that position of being a minority population. That as a minority, they do not have protection, and so what the Zionist movement is calling for is the creation of a state to protect the nation of the Jewish population. And for a variety of reasons, for historical reasons, biblical reasons, whatever, they saw that as Palestine. Now, the Ottomans were favorable to Jewish migration. The Brits were favorable to Jewish migration for a variety of reasons, mostly domestic. And so this is really the founding of the early Jewish presence in what was then Palestine. Part of the twist here is the narrative that the Zionists laid out was that this is a backwater of the Ottoman Empire. There's no one here. We're a Jewish population. We're a nation without a land, and here's a land without a people. Of course, when the early settlers get there, they're shocked to find that the area is populated, that there is in fact indigenous populations there. And so much of the early 20th century is a struggle for these different communities to live with one another under British rule, and it turns violent in the lead up to 1946 and in the lead up to end of World War One, the end of World War Two, creation of the State of Israel, and Israel was created in large measure because the Jewish population has support from both Washington and London, and hence, you have the creation of the State of Israel. What the Jewish population of Europe saw as independence and this great marvel, and the Palestinian population referred to as al-Makhba, the catastrophe, because it meant the displacement of literally half the Jewish Palestinian population in the region. While our students are thinking of questions, I'll throw out two last comments here. So there's two major wars that have shaped this map. 1948, a number of armies from Egypt, Jordan, Iraq, I think it was Syria, invade. They're defeated. That's a long story. But that's what shapes that third map of 1949, 1967. The Israelis used that war as a way to consolidate territory. And then, of course, you have the 1967 war, where they captured not just Gaza and the West Bank and East Jerusalem, but they also captured the Sinai Peninsula, the Golan Heights, and that's really the framework for where we are today. So, Laith,
so what you're saying is that after the Holocaust,
right,
Europe really wants to get rid of Jews.
Well, it's more a matter of the Jewish populations wanted an independent homeland, or this way, they wanted a state to protect themselves, and they wanted that independent homeland in the state of Palestine, and the European powers supported
How
them.
can you make an independent sovereign state on somebody else's back?
Scott, do you
Yeah,
mind
go
if I
ahead.
jump in here a
Please, yeah,
little bit?
please do.
So Scott has provided us a great comprehensive introduction through the sort of broad strokes of what happens before World War I, during World War I with the Balfour Declaration, so on and so forth. And let me just add a little bit of the complexity. I do appreciate the fact that Ta-Nehisi Coates recently said on Democracy Now! That there's nothing complex about this. There's one group of people being occupied by another, and I could not agree with him more. So I'm not trying to disabuse the audience of the clarity of that. That is absolutely clear that the Palestinians are being occupied and prevented from nationhood. But I think that the origins and impetus of Zionism is complex and need to be understood on their own terms. So what Scott was saying earlier is absolutely correct. It's essentially a borrowed theme from the European idea of the nation state. And stemming from the Dreyfus Affair in France, people like Theodore Herzl were motivated to start to articulate theories of nationhood that would therefore entitle them to statehood. So this idea that the nation is a group of people who share common characteristics, whether that be ethnicity, language, history, etc., are entitled to a state, which is the political expression and embodiment of their sovereignty as a people. So the early Zionists were trying to articulate a theory of nationhood and statehood that would entitle them to a land with people on it. They were not ignorant to the fact that there were people on this land. The Balfour Declaration declared there were no people to the land, perhaps because it was relying on particular European theories of sovereignty or statehood, or because they were just reckless with power and said that they could say whatever they wanted to say. I mean, either or. But I think that the early Zionists, the Herzls, the Jabotinsky's, etc., they articulated this idea where they borrowed a lot of these European notions of labor. For example, a Lockean notion of labor, that if you worked on something, it was an extension of yourself and therefore belonged to you. So they started to articulate these false narratives that even if there were Palestinians there, they didn't cultivate the land. Thus, they were not entitled to it. We saw similar articulations with the Native American population in the United States, right? And, obviously, it's a problem in and of itself. Why a certain theory of labor should entitle you to the land is one problem. And without disparaging or discrediting whatever Native Americans may have done with the land, I am not schooled in that field. But the other thing about the Palestinians is it wasn't true, right? I mean, there was deep cultivation of the land. The Fellaheen represent a particular certain class and culture of people in Palestine. And then probably, this may be getting me in trouble with all kinds of people, but I don't care. The Fellaheen, the Palestinian Fellaheen are probably the most direct descendants of the ancient Israelites that are walking the face of the earth. They just over time adopted Arabic and adopted the Islamic religion and became Arabicized, right? So the fact that Ashkenazi Jews want to displace native Palestinians is not only unjust, but ironic. So on the one hand, I totally appreciate what Ta-Nehisi Coates says when he says, there's nothing complicated about occupation. There's nothing complicated about discrimination. There's nothing complicated about apartheid. I wholeheartedly agree. At the same time, the history is very complicated. And I think we can walk around with both of those notions in our head at the same time.
And a nice summation, by the way, Laith.
I know my students have oodles of questions.
If I may follow up on the last comment, Dr. Saud, because to the extent that we, let's say Zionists have formulated a rationale to justify a claim to the land, nonetheless, if we look at basic human rights, there is no, in my mind, there's an absence of justification for the taking of the land, as if, once again, I guess, following through on the point that they had laid claim to this land. So is it not, we're really looking at someone's rationale has been given credence over another's. I mean, I don't see how that takes away from the claim of the Palestinians to this land.
No, you're exactly right. I mean, just one quick comment. At the end of the day, the core of the conflict is you have like two nations, two peoples, two communities, each laying claim to one particular piece of land, and they've developed, competing narratives as to, why each has a right to it. But at the end of the day, a lot of it is just, who has the force to enact their will and to control the territory.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's kind of, how it's played out. And that's why the Israelis have had the upper hand and the Palestinians have been subjugated. Again, historical context, the uprising in 1936 to 39 weakened the Palestinian community and lead up to World War II. When the Israelis, during World War II, the Israelis were preparing for war in the way that the Palestinian population was not. And so they had the upper hand in the immediate aftermath of the creation of the State of Israel. And then, the 1967 really changed everything. And just not because one narrative was more important than the other, but just the force of arms determined the outcome of that conflict.
And if I may add to that, I mean, Scott is bringing up something that I've been thinking about for a very, very long time. The whole point of power, and you can look at this into political theory, you can look at this in theology, you can look at this in even like politics. Ultimately, the whole point of power is the ability to apply rules that don't apply to you. That's kind of ultimately it.
Yeah.
It's the ultimate proof and characteristic that you have power. And I think to boil all this down to one simple thing, it is the fact of power. So now when I'm hearing people say that I can't use the term from river to the sea, it's a geographical territory. We're referring to just a simple fact of what territory is in dispute. It's from the river to the sea. But some people cannot use it, and some people can. The loss of some civilian life does not matter. The loss of civilian life on the other side does. Humanitarian law and international law is applied to some, and it is overlooked with others. Whenever you see disparity and you see hypocrisy or you see double standards, you're seeing the application of power. And I think that on the one hand takes us up against a wall. We made a brick wall in that analysis because we're going to say, is that ultimately what it is? Yes. So if you ask yourself why is it some narratives win over others? Why is the law applied sometimes over others? Why is it one civilian life is not worth as much as another? It's ultimately the application of power. I don't know where we go from there, but that is a fact we have to reconcile ourselves with.
Mm-hmm. Questions, considerations. Have we done enough to lay a background?
Yes, I would ask if there was a
the other, I guess.
I'm sorry. I was going to ask if there was a historical precedent for different methods of, I guess, determining land ownership or land occupation that has worked with two different systems in the past, or is it just people who haven't found each other yet?
So that's a great question, Miriam.
It is.
One of the things that that's troubling about this region in particular, I mean, just the entire region, is there's a lot of ethnic cleansing. In Ottoman territories, in Russian territories, and European territories, there's a lot of displacement of populations. And at the end of the day, where you do see some kind of modus vivendi emerge, it's generally within kind of a cosmopolitan political framework. But those are very tenuous, and as we see in our own country, ostensibly we're built on this diversity, and yet we're fraying at the seams. one last comment I'll make about the 1967 war is, there was a lot of conscious displacement of Palestinians from Israel, and the historical documents have been coming out and kind of recognized that Israel was trying to push Palestinians off land. But what really changed in 67 was the capture of all this land, with Palestinians. And now you shift from having kind of two populations somewhat side by side, though unequal, to now one side ruling over a good chunk of the population in the other. And that really fundamentally transformed the nature of the conflict. And I think that that's really still, that occupation is the essence of the problem at this point.
Awesome. This is Professor Aminah Al-Deen with Critical Talk. This evening, Critical Talk is a classroom, and we're looking at the fog slowly lifting about, for many of us, that part of history that we don't know. We have two expert professors, Dr. Laith and Dr. Scott Hibbard, and a classroom full of people, a late student named Abdullah Mitchell, Kamila, Barbour, Miriam Teasdale, and back there somewhere in the back of the room is Sherdil Khan. We will be back. We're going to take a break for 2 minutes and come back with an additional set of questions. Assalamu alaikum. This is Professor Aminah Al-Deen with Critical Talk, and this evening we're having a special program where we've turned Critical Talk, which is a talk show, into a classroom, because there's so many things that we don't know about one of the issues facing global society at the present. With us, we have two expert professors, Professor Scott Hibbard, who is the chair of political science at DePaul University, and Dr. Laith, who is an author, a scholar, and good friend. We also have, which is unusual, a class of folk who have volunteered to come on and just ask away. So we have Kamila Barbour, we have Abdullah Mitchell, we have Miriam Tisdale, and we are trying to sort through. And in that, being taught how to become critical thinkers. What are the questions we should ask? So now we kind of want to skip over to, and it doesn't mean we can't go back, whose interests are being served in the current 2023 conflict in the place.
Laith, I'm going to let you start with that one.
BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard. Is anybody familiar with those names? In other words, the military-industrial complex. In other words, those who profit from war. In other words, those politicians who, have very little to offer. Okay. So let me do this. Let me not get so abstract and break things down, as my late mentor Sharif Bassouni used to always say, into manageable parts. We are facing a current conflict and conflagration that is horrible to our eyes and our ears and our senses of human suffering. I've never felt like this. And I was born in Iraq, and this has horrified me even more than the Gulf War, meaning the destruction being wrought upon the Palestinian people. But let's break things down into practical political motivations at the moment. What happened on October 7th, 2023 was embarrassing to Benjamin Netanyahu. It had severe political consequences for the geopolitics of the region, and particularly for his political career. So what do I mean? In terms of the geopolitics, it is well known that the Arabs, particularly Saudi Arabia, were leading the charge on normalization with the Israelis. And had they achieved normalization along the lines of the Abraham Accords, which was spawned by Donald Trump, then essentially the Palestinians would have been relegated into a sideline issue, if not altogether abandoned. The reason why the Arabs were so open and amenable to normalization after all of these years is not necessarily because they look at the reality of the Palestinians differently, but because the reality of Israel as being something that's inevitable. Right? You okay, Aminah? All right. Because Israel as something perceived as something inevitable was accepted. So for the Saudis, the rest of the Gulf states, Israel was perceived as inevitable, and its inevitability was built upon its invincibility. Well, October 7th compromised that view of invincibility. I don't think it's going to necessarily take the direction of normalization, but the idea that the Israelis are invincible has been compromised. So from a geopolitical standpoint, that happened on October 7th. Netanyahu's political career is finished. I mean, unless there's some miracle, he's finished. And he has no incentive in ending this conflict, because by perpetuating the conflict and hoping that he can achieve something out of it, that he can win something, whether it's land or the claim that he got rid of Hamas, he is looking for a major win here because he is desperately holding on to his political future, which in my estimation, and I would love to hear Scott's opinion on this, is over. The moment this conflict comes to an end, the Israelis are going to have their way with him. And the other thing that I'd like to say is our media is horrible at representing the diversity of views that exist amongst Israelis. If we were to watch American television only, we would assume that all Israelis are Likud right-wingers, and nothing could be further from the truth. So his political career is incredibly tenuous at the moment, and the only thing he can come up with is to devastate as many Palestinian lives as possible to make him seem strong. It's quite pathetic, but that's my take on it. I would love to hear Scott's take on it.
Yeah. So I think the operative comment that you made is his Netanyahu's career is over once the war is over.
Right.
This is an important thing, because as long as the war drags on, there's a possibility of redemption. Mm-hmm. And what people forget is on October 6th, or the 10 months leading up to October 6th, there were daily protests of like tens of, not hundreds of thousands of Israelis in the streets protesting his government. He has the most extreme right-wing, narrow majority, ever. And he's, and he's actually, and part of the reason he wants to stay in power is he doesn't want to be prosecuted for corruption, which charges have been filed against him. As long as he's prime minister, he can't go to prison. He can't be tried. So there's a lot of reasons why he's desperate to just kind of stay in power. And so in an odd way, the more this war drags out, the better off he sees himself being. Now, I would add also that the war serves the interest of Hamas, and that the real losers in all of this are the Israeli people and the Palestinian people. And I don't think that the leadership of either Hamas or Netanyahu represents the interests of the population. They represent their own very narrow niche perspectives and niche interests, and they're and they both see conflict as serving their particular interests. And the last comment I'll make is the Oslo Accords had their flaws, but when the Oslo Accords were being negotiated and were slowly being implemented with Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat, there was an enormous amount of support for peace within both the Jewish population and the Palestinian, or the Israeli population and the Palestinian population. The people who really were doing everything they could to destroy the peace process was Netanyahu and the settler movement and Hamas, and they ended up getting their way. And because of that, because of the collapse of the peace process, the centrists on both sides were increasingly marginalized, and that's why you have the extremes of both political perspectives running at least these two areas.
Miriam, I think back there somewhere there's a question from someone in the audience. Assalamu alaikum. It is better to focus on the human right violations. No, is it better to focus on the human rights violations at this time or teach people the history first to bring about long term change? That's a big question.
That's a good
I,
question. Yeah,
I
it's a great
think
question.
I think
Go
it's a
ahead.
great question too, and I think I know exactly what Tayyib was getting at. It's the frustration of watching such flagrant violations of human rights right in front of your face require long uh, explanations of history. You know, if I'm seeing somebody being pummeled, do I need to know the history? It's a good question, right? But I think it comes from multiple places. So, on the one hand, I think that for the average American, they're trying to develop cultural literacy pursuant to human rights. So we think that the average American doesn't know anything about the region, and they think that Hamas flew in from Mars and started to attack Israelis, and that everything started on October 7th. Now, obviously, that would be historically ignorant. Thus, we embark on the attempt to make us historically more literate and culturally more literate. So I don't think that the two things are separate, but I can understand the urgency of saying, do I really need a long historical lesson when I'm looking at a clear violation of human rights right in front of my eyes? I don't need to know what a 4-year-old's history is to know that they should not be buried under the rubble of bombs. I don't need to know what a 3-year-old's history is to know that they deserve electricity and fuel to be delivered to them in the hospital when they're suffering from an injury. So I completely appreciate the urgency. They're not mutually exclusive. And in fact, I think people are trying to tell the history because they're trying to get those in power and them, or those theoretically who have the ability to change things in democratic societies, the information and knowledge they need to make those changes in policy.
And also, I would also add that part of what we're trying to do here is understand the complexity, so that we don't make rash judgments. And I'm thinking particularly of colleagues of mine who are Israeli and Jewish and adamantly opposed to the Netanyahu government and are adamantly opposed to this war. And they look at this from a moral perspective, that they see the death and they see this as a violation of the Judaic tradition. So it's important for us, in this forum to recognize that, I mean, there's a complexity to this, and it's not just us and them, that there is a, within the, Israeli population, within the within the American Jewish population, there is a recognition that, there's a humanitarian crisis going on. How we move beyond it, or how we, let's be honest, change the U.S. government's policy, because I know that there are many people within the U.S. government that are just horrified by, the blanket support that the Biden administration has given to the Netanyahu government. How we get to the next step is a different matter, a more challenging one.
And Scott, I deeply appreciate what you just said. Again, I'll repeat myself. If you watch American media, you'd be under the impression that all Israelis are right wingers, and you may be even under the impression all Jews are right wingers, and it's ludicrous. You don't see Jewish Voices for Peace ever being interviewed on CNN. You don't see Bet Salem, one of the great human rights organizations out of Israel, ever being interviewed in Western media. You would think Gideon Levy doesn't write and exist. You would think Norman Finkelstein. I mean, on and on we can go, where there are Jewish intellectuals who are deeply severe and critical of Israel's policies, not just regarding the response to October 7th, but writ large regarding the occupation altogether. And they are likewise silenced. And again, for me, perhaps this reveals a few of my Marxist sociological biases, but I just feel that when you think about the deep interests at work here, military industrial complex, these large industrial interests that are at work, that really oil the machine of our politics behind the scenes. This is not, I think, primarily ethnically driven, although there's an undertone of racism in terms of a lack of sympathy for Palestinians in the West. I think this is driven by economics and industrial interests.
Yeah, and let's be honest too. Part of the pro-Israeli, or part of the biggest part of the pro-Israeli constituency in the United States are evangelical Christians, extreme evangelical Christians, who really do see, the Bible unfolding in time, and they're waiting for the rapture. And the sooner war happens, the sooner the rapture is going to happen.
I shouldn't laugh. I mean, I have dear
I
friends.
know, no, it's Pastor
beliefs.
John Hagee, the founder of Christians Unite for Israel. He's written books about the rapture, and that's where he's coming from. And yes, he was one of the speakers at the Trump moment, or whatever, the unveiling of the embassy in Jerusalem by Donald Trump. I mean, it's a little shocking.
What
class? Where are you?
What? I mean, I'm recognizing the political landscape and the power dynamics as the two of you have mapped them out. Nonetheless, we as concerned citizens of the world are seeing the sanctity of life being totally disregarded. I mean, where there's evidence of war crimes being committed by the military complex, and we see a Congress and an administration, at least its head leaders, all in step with equating the right to defend, Israel's right to defend is equated with them being able to do whatever they want to do. I guess really what I'm speaking to now, speaking to that frustration, what do you see, either of you see, as steps that we as, people concerned about human rights, what can be done? What should we be?
Laith, do you want to give that a shot?
The power complex that it is.
Yeah, I mean, first, sabar will iman billah. Like, the first thing is you're gonna, to be honest with you, Abdullah, I don't have an answer to your question. I think I'm about to embark on some bullshit. This has been very difficult for me. This has been very difficult for a lot of people I know, because it's very difficult to watch in real time. You're watching somebody tell you your life is not worth as much as others. And I think you as a black man and as a Muslim man can understand that. Me and as an Arab man and as a Muslim man, I am reading the message loud and clear that my life is not as worth as much as somebody else's. Okay? At least in this particular context, and at least amongst these particular parties. That is very, very difficult to swallow and just go, okay, you got it. I guess I'm just going to lay down here and submit myself to the law of power here. You have the power, I don't. I'm just going to shut up, which is an undignified existence. And for many of us, it's not acceptable existence.
Arab countries vetoed the UN resolution, was it yesterday, day before yesterday, I think it was for a ceasefire, I'm not sure. But then 2 weeks ago or a week ago, Saudi Arabia, in this conference held in Saudi Arabia, said enough is enough. So, it's like speaking out of both sides of your face without even having a handkerchief.
There is that, but I don't want to. Let me complete what I want to say to Abdullah first, because in the face of such despair, you don't have to submit to it. And I know, Abdullah, you and I actually have met before. I don't know if you recall that, and I know you wouldn't. I don't believe anyone on this panel would. I know Scott is a courageous man and a courageous scholar. He always has been. So patience, a commitment and a faith to doing the right thing, and whether it requires you speaking on it, whether it requires you marching on it, whether it requires you boycotting on it, whether it requires you educating and edifying things for other people on it, whatever the case may be, whatever contribution you can make, it is welcome, beyond either contributing to it or remaining indifferent to it. So, I mean, I think that there's a net positive that you can take away, however futile those actions may feel, whether it's boycotting, educating, speaking out, marching, whatever the case may be. So I really don't know what else to tell you.
So let me chime in, because Farah Khan asked a very similar question, which is, at the end of the day, what then must be done? Different way of phrasing it. How do you keep the momentum, or when it feels like the political process is corrupt and may take generations to change? I would argue that it won't take generations. I think it's going to take a generation. I think the generation that's coming of age right now has very different views than the generation that's in power. And what's interesting is, the baby boomers are still in power. The echo boom is really, is bigger, and they're, much more progressive and on any number of issues. And I think things like what's happening now is really radicalizing, the younger generation. And there has been an enormous amount of change within the Democratic Party in terms of its attitudes towards Israel. For many years, everyone marched in lockstep. Republicans, Democrats, centrists, leftists, whatever. Everyone is very pro-Israel, and I think that's really changing. I think the challenge is how to find a more nuanced policy when you do still have kind of the power structures in place that are kind of driving the process. But again, time, engagement, effort, it will pay off in the long run. My opinion. By the way, if I can just throw out one last comment on this, I used to work in politics. I used to work for Democrats.
If I just follow up,
please.
Once again,
go ahead.
Being an African American male, I mean, it's like you're getting a throwback to the 50s and the 60s in terms of when African Americans were fighting for civil rights and the human between killings and hosing, and I mean, how I think it does causes deep concern, because what is happening, what we're seeing is happening on the world stage could happen to any marginalized people. When you expect even the rules that those in power create are being flaunted and ignored. Yeah, I guess realistically is what can, once again, I take note, yes, we shouldn't remain silent. We should not do anything, but it is more like on the line of what can be some strategic steps that we can take to combat this in the future, because I don't believe this is a one-time affair. It's just the way it's been orchestrated. So and to have so many corporate leaders all of a sudden coming out, anyone who speaks on behalf of Palestine now, it's created a chilling effect even on people's right to speak. So once again, it is as a member of the public grappling for what are we going to do, because we just can't tolerate this kind of, we can't accept this.
Yeah. I mean, look, just quickly, there's things that have occurred with this particular iteration of the war on terror, if I may call it that, right? Mm-hmm. That did not occur even after 2001. So there's the degree of resemblance to 2001, obviously. And I'm referring to 9/11, right? September 11, 2001, which precipitated the invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq on the part of the United States, but was well aligned with the Israeli narrative of, terrorism. We're fighting terrorism, right? But I cannot recall this type of censorship then. And I remember being a college student at the time, and I would actually give talks against the war, and was more than tolerated. People listened. Nobody tried to obstruct my ability to speak. And now I'm seeing college students getting doxxed, getting prevented from having jobs in the future, being blacklisted, and also for relatively innocuous things like saying from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, statements. But that goes to the larger issue of power, because by controlling language, you control what you can talk about. And by controlling what we can talk about, you control presence or erasure. And, by saying you cannot say Palestine from the river to the sea, you're essentially saying the Palestinians don't exist. That's ultimately the implication in that. So I too, on the one hand, raise an eyebrow when it comes to seeing the type of censorship that we're seeing now. On the other hand, to piggyback off what Scott was saying a few moments ago, I think this is desperation, because those who've been pro-Israel, particularly pro-white, right-wing Likud Israel, are seeing that the future generations just do not buy into that narrative, and that future generations are not going to be pro-Israeli in that sense. So there's almost this last gasp attempt to control the way we talk about this.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. One last comment. I know we need to go to a break, but I totally agree with everything you said, Laith. The one area I disagree with is after 9/11, there was a lot more intolerance for dissent than you're remembering. And
Yeah.
I mean, because that's, well, anyway. Part of the reason I mentioned this is I was living in Egypt for part of that, both in 2000 and 2002. And I came back to the United States in the lead up to the Iraq War, and I was shocked at how just everybody was going along with it. And I really could not believe, that this was happening, but it's just, that's where the momentum, the frame of debate was so narrow. And, and the media kind of characterized in such a way, everybody, like CBS, NBC. And
yes, Scott. And I appreciate that. And I appreciate your experience very much. However, I was in 2005, I was writing for major publications defending the Iraqis' right to fight the Americans.
Yeah.
I mean, I was publishing that in 2005 and 2006, and I had no fear of being sent to Guantanamo Bay at the time. Maybe I was being naive. But I openly defended Iraq's right to defend itself against an invasion, which was both illegal and immoral from my point of view. I would find it very difficult for anybody to defend in today's climate, to defend the Palestinians' right to fight occupation, which is an international right, which is a right by international law, without the fear that everything is going to come crashing down on them. So I guess we may have different perspectives. We may have different experiences on this. I do appreciate the fact that the race to invade Iraq was swift and there was very little resistance to it. So I appreciate saying in that respect. But I don't recall the censorship on the part of the public for what they could say, and the way that I feel college students today or graduate students today feel like their entire I spoke that way, and I spoke that way boldly without fear to what was going to happen to my future. And
I think you're bold, Laith. But there was a lot of self-censorship, particularly in the academy at that moment in time. But
let me, since it keeps coming up, ask the two of you and the class, explain international human rights. And Americans think that the quote unquote rights they think they have as Americans are all over the world. But give me some clarification here.
Where to start? We do have an attorney here, so maybe we could. Do you want to take a break or?
Okay, well, let me say this. While you're thinking about it, let me say this is Professor Aminah Al-Deen for Critical Talk in a experimental classroom on the one issue of today with Professor Scott Hibbard, Laith, and a class with Kamila Barbour, Abdullah Mitchell, and Miriam Teasdale. We will be back and we will be talking about the notion of rights and what are the rights, but also Islamophobia, anti-Semitism. Stuff is just getting all conflated here. We'll be right back. Good evening. This is I am Professor Aminah Al-Deen in a wonderful classroom on Critical Talk that we're experimenting with a format. And we're talking about one of the many issues of the day, which is all over the place. It's Gaza, it's the West Bank, it's whose interests are there weighing in on this. And also, now we're going to look a little bit at Islamophobia and what is happening to the narrative. Our two lecturing professors today are Professor Scott Hibbard, who's the chair of political science at DePaul University of Chicago, and Dr. Laith, who is an author, a scholar, a writer, and a courageous young man. We have a wonderful classroom of Kamila Barbour, Abdullah Mitchell, and Miriam Teasdale. I want to go back to the last issue, and that is we talk a lot about rights. We talk about rights so much that we forget what are permissions and what are actual rights. Then we talk about human rights. Give me some definition and some clarity.
So, well, I'll jump in, but we do have a lawyer here, so we should let the lawyer talk. But very basically, when we talk about international human rights, it's rooted in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights law, has its own legacy of going back to natural law. But the Universal Declaration of Human Rights law was an attempt to kind of create a binding set of international laws that would protect individual rights in the face of persecution by states. It was subsequently codified in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and later a separate document on economic, cultural, and social rights. I think that's it. And the assumption is that those members of the United Nations that were joining the UN were expected to take the language of these international covenants, which they agreed to and signed, and put them into their own constitutions, and therefore they would be enforceable domestically. Now, the kind of key element here is rights are premised upon and some kind of enforcement mechanism. And if the enforcement mechanism isn't there, well, then you just have a piece of paper. And I think this is where we find ourselves today. We talk a lot about the violation of international human rights when we're talking about China, we're talking about Iraq, we're talking about countries we don't like. We, the United States, U.S. government, tends to overlook the violation of international human rights law when it is being carried out by people that are our allies. So,
if I may piggyback on what Scott's saying, because I think what we're talking about right now, in order to really get to brass tacks here and get to the bottom line, we're talking about, are rights really effective? Because we're seeing them being violated in front of our eyes, right? So the concept of the distinction between human rights and sort of political rights in a domestic sense, I think ultimately we're talking about what makes rights effective or not. Sorry if I'm being presumptuous, but this gets back to politics. And I don't think, I'm not one of those people that think that race is an independent variable that causes conflict. I do think race is one of those dependent, and by race I mean groupings, ethnicity, anything in which you're going to define one group against another. Okay? I do think it's one of those independent variables that is activated in a political sphere. So what is politics? Politics is the distribution of resources and power. Scott, correct me if I'm wrong, please, on that.
No, that's
politics, right? Politics is essentially the distribution of resources.
Who gets what?
Who gets what? You have to define the who. And when you define the who against someone else, a lot of times people are willing to be part of the who. Okay? So whether we're talking about the Jim Crow South, where we can tell a poor white guy, you get to sit in the front of the bus. And he goes, well, look at that. I get the privilege of being able to sit in the front of the bus. You'll find that person to be wholeheartedly supportive of politics that by and large don't help that person at all. And I think in terms of rights right now, we're seeing something play off similarly where somebody like Netanyahu appeals to a right-wing base, a very strong national identity. And then in the larger sphere writ large, we see people appealing to this Western identity. We got to defend the West and defend democracy and defend this stuff. So people are willing to turn a blind eye to what they see as human rights violations right in front of their faces, or they don't recognize them as human rights violations at all. Because we don't have an independent mechanism. All of these things are politicized, is ultimately what I'm saying. We don't have an independent, transcendent mechanism that is able to apply the law in such a way that transcends the politics of me and them, us and them. Does that make sense what I'm saying there? I feel it was a bit convoluted.
Yeah, I'd like to hear the students' comments on what their take on rights is. And I think Kamila looks like she wants to say something. Maybe Abdullah wants to chime in.
Well, I had a question, actually. I wanted to go back to something you mentioned in the first section. You talked about the people who stand to benefit from this conflict and this war. When we see human rights being denied, we tend to look to our lawmakers, when often, if we follow the money, we find the real motivation behind a lot of conflicts. But we don't talk about economic pressure as a means for making change.
Mm-hmm.
In these, do we continue? I mean, where should we be looking? Should we be following the money that ultimately drives a lot of these narratives, or should we put the pressure on our lawmakers to make those changes on our behalf as citizens?
So I'll just give a first answer. I want to hear what Laith's comment is, but I would still argue that that, and I say this based on I used to work in Congress. I was a legislative staff member for many years, and members of Congress are very attuned to what their constituents think, much more than you think. And so putting pressure on your local member of Congress, you really can have an impact in a much more profound way than you might appreciate. So they're at the end of the day, they all want to get reelected. And if they know that if they feel like they are out of step with a significant portion of their constituency, they will change. And that's a way to have your voice heard at a national level. But Laith, what you want to?
What about economic pressure?
Sure.
Like boycotts?
Sure.
From regular citizens like myself, what can we do?
You mean like
should we take that road?
You're talking about boycotting, I assume. Yeah.
All the above.
All the above.
Buy an electric car.
All the above. All the above. I mean, really, like.
A lot of what drives the politics in the region is oil.
What is your opinion on BDS laws?
Here we're talking about rights again. Scott is on the one hand absolutely correct, and I've been mirroring what he's saying, that rights are meaningless without the power to apply them, but they're also meaningless without the power to assert them. So you have a right, So although I appear cynical, I am actually. Although I am cynical about rights, don't take me to mean you should abandon your rights. You have to assert them as well. You have the absolute right to boycott. You have the absolute right. It's a freedom of speech right. It's a personal right. You have a right to boycott. And if you feel that somebody is endorsing something or supporting something or patronizing something that goes beyond your morals, then by all means boycott. I agree with Scott as well that I think that your vote means more to your politician than you believe. But a lot of things mean things to politicians: money, exposure, access to platforms of power, right? So you may feel that you don't have those kind of resources available to you. I know I certainly do. But nonetheless, we shouldn't neglect the fact that they do care about what their constituents think. So all the above, I think in terms of boycotting, it's a very powerful instrument. Historically, it's been a powerful instrument. And I think it continues to be a powerful instrument to this day on this particular issue.
Can we get our lawyer's view on rights?
I want to stand on a thin line. We say lawyers knowing the rights. We're in the international arena. These things have not been, as you said, fully defined. There's statements, but what like I said is, to the extent we don't have a mechanism for enforcement, even when we look at the International Criminal Court, it's always good to get some person in a small African country. But then when you start talking about will Netanyahu be held accountable for that? I'm not anticipating that. But nonetheless, to follow up your comment, I think, yes, we should do all of those things. I think the real challenge right now for the Muslim community here in the United States is to have a consensus on a course of action. right now people are reacting to how emotions and how they feel. They want to, I mean, the easiest, well, I'm going to say necessarily easiest, but probably the most vocal thing are mass rallies. But the two things that really speak to politicians are votes and money. And to the extent that there is a boycott, to the extent that the Muslims make a candidate the statement of, okay, we got a senatorial election coming in Illinois, and wherever you're at, to those politicians that fail to even speak to even request a ceasefire, we should, if we, by mobilizing the Muslim vote, or really all people that are concerned about life, against those kinds of politicians, I think that will be something that can be done. And I think if we look at how through social media we witness Arab Springs, and it did have an impact. It did get those in power, got their attention. And the question is how do we maintain that kind of movement?
So let's, in our last few minutes, we got a good chunk of time left. What is anti-Semitism?
So, well, go ahead.
Yeah, it's an a priori irrational, baseless hatred of Jewish people.
Yes.
So what kind of priori?
A priori.
Yeah, it's this. Yeah.
Clarify.
You hate Jewish people. I mean, it's
All
racism.
Yes. So if I can kind of elaborate on this. So what's interesting about Islamophobia and anti-Semitism is at the end of the day, they're about fear and hate of another and other community, generally in a minority population within your midst. And in looking at, and there's a much longer history to anti-Semitism, maybe I shouldn't say this, but there's a long history of anti-Semitism in Europe. Islamophobia is been around for ages, but it's become just really pronounced in the aftermath of 9/11. But there's a sense that, we are a virtuous us and they are a unvirtuous other, and they are threatening and therefore worthy of, discrimination, persecution, and violence. And that's what justified, invading Iraq, invading Afghanistan. It's what, justifies targeting, Jewish populations in Europe in the 18th, 19th, 20th century. But again, there's always this element of us and them. And so in some respects, there's a communal sensibility to this, that, we are a majority population and we fear this minority in our midst. And I think that the real challenge here, just as an ethical human being, is at the end of the day, you lose sight of the shared humanity which we all have. And we also lose sight of the fact that there's difference within this community. Okay, Osama bin Laden, attacked America. Doesn't mean my neighbor Laith, is a bad person. Right? There's a tendency to conflate, populations and to see them in a very homogeneous sense. And the unfortunate thing is, in times of war, it contributes to that, kind of hardening of identities. But a colleague of mine, a friend who teaches at Cornell University, wrote this really powerful piece condemning both anti-Semitism and Islamophobia in the current moment. And his kind of the punchline of his narrative is, there's no us and them, there's only us. There's only we. It's only the shared humanity. And trying to get to that point, either politically or morally or whatever, is challenging in these times.
Yeah, and just to piggyback on that a little bit,
What?
Racism. I remember I did a TED talk several years ago, and I talked about.
It's good. Google it.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Our biological disposition to be suspicious and cautious around people who don't look like us or talk like us. We do have a biological disposition. It's related into, early bioanthropology and the way we've developed as human beings. You see another group of strangers across the desert or across the field or across the jungle or across the hills. Good chance that their males are going to want to kill your males, and take your females as slaves and kill the kids, etc., etc. So I've always been somewhat generous about people's predisposition to be prejudicial. I don't find it to be morally satisfying when I see somebody who just they're a bit prejudicial. I'm like, oh my God, what a racist. Okay. It's part of the human condition to be a little ignorant. It's part of the human condition to algorithmize things and just sort of apply these even tropes to some extent, if you want to call them that. Okay. I don't care to hang people morally for exhibiting commonplace human tendencies. I think the key is, and this is to piggyback off what Scott was saying, was when racism serves an ideological function, okay, where it doesn't matter what your experience is with these other people. You're going to hold, that's why I said a priori, you're going to hold a narrative in your mind that insists they should be deprived of basic rights that you should be entitled to. And I think it's that threshold, because I know a lot of people have prejudicial feelings, but they don't think people from different backgrounds should be deprived of the same rights that they have. They realize that that's unreasonable. That's not good. That's unfair. They may think some kind of people don't drive well. They may think other people are late for meetings. They may think other people are whatever, right? But they're not sitting around going, we need to get rid of those people. They're not sitting around going, we need to have concentration camps on those people. They're not thinking about they should not have them on television. So I think racism for me hits a threshold of concern when it becomes ideological and serves as the basis of saying those people should be deprived of political rights. And the irony of what we're saying is that's exactly the situation in Palestine as we speak. Okay, that there is a certain application of an ideology that says these people are fundamentally unentitled to the rights that we enjoy as Israelis from the river to the sea. This is the land that we're talking about here. But we've seen many applications of this type of racism. We've seen many applications of this type of anti-Semitism as well throughout Europe, particularly, where there was a clear ideological platform, but then, energies were invested, attention was devoted to distract people from what was going on economically or the failures of inherent political classes, so that they would have a scapegoat in Jewish people. Sorry, I was a little bit long-winded there.
No, that's good.
Yeah, but that's okay. As long as it's all about getting some clarity. Let me ask my producer to put up, we have a side-by-side of Gaza City before October bombing and after. On the right, there's a thriving city there with well demarcated streets and trees. And now look at it. You can't, I probably have the wrong term, but what was it that we put together for Europe after World War II?
Marshall Plan.
Marshall Plan.
Right. How long did that take?
Well,
A while. I mean, we put in like 13. Sorry, go ahead.
May I go back to the earlier question, the definition of anti-Semitism? Because I think while I can accept that definition that Dr. Saud, you put there, I agree with that. The problem right now is that to the extent that you, like I say, make an expression in favor of Palestine, all of a sudden, then that becomes anti-Semitic. There have been, I've witnessed, read an article by a professor here in Chicago who framed or a ceasefire.
Deli, you froze on us there. You still there?
That therein lies, once again, if we use that the theoretical framework that you've given, that would, to me, is what anti-Semitism is. But once it gets to the point that it's expanded, where people are afraid to even voice an opinion because you will be labeled anti-Semitic, and next thing you know, just like here in Illinois, laws are passed to curb to boycott or divest sanction, it has a chilling effect, and in my mind, it distorts what anti-Semitism is, or to the extent that we even talk about Islamophobia. But that really hasn't been the problem. We haven't had those kinds of expressions. But like I said, the current circumstances we're witnessing now, seeing how this whole concept of anti-Semitism has been conflated, expanded, however you want to view it, to now incorporate even expressions of speech that do not take anything away from the other.
If I can comment on that, you're raising a really important point, and this is something that the Netanyahu government has done a lot, is if you're critical of Israeli policies, they claim that that's anti-Semitic. And what you're really doing is you're just being critical of the policies of the state of Israel. You're not being critical of Israeli people or Jewish. You're not engaging in anti-Semitism, but they, at least the Netanyahu people have, made an argument that's anti-Semitic, and that's a false narrative. But it is, as you rightly point out, it's a chilling one. It definitely chills discourse.
I've been wrestling with a lot of things for 20 years, really, since 2001. But many of them have sort of been resurrected in the last couple of weeks. And let's say, for example, the debate about whether anti-Zionism is equal to anti-Semitism, right? And I have a simple question for any Zionist. If Zionism means equal rights, equal dignity, and equal freedom for all the inhabitants of that particular parcel of land from the river to the sea, I'll be the first one to sign up. If Zionism means that the Palestinians enjoy equal rights, equal freedom, and equal dignity in that part of the world, I have no problem signing up for Zionism. I've just never seen a Zionist say that that's what it means. And it seems to me that what Zionism means is that it's going to be the displacement of a certain group of people who are going to be denied rights altogether. Please, someone correct me if I'm wrong. Someone correct me if I have the wrong understanding of Zionism. I'm more than happy to be corrected. But until then, I cannot deny the rights of a group of people to live in dignity, freedom, so that I cannot be a racist, if that makes any sense at all, because it doesn't. I have a hard time making sense of it. But if somebody accuses me of being racist because I'm anti-Zionist, I can't be racist against the Palestinians in order to not be racist. It becomes a conundrum, a confounding, ridiculous conundrum. But if somebody can tell me that it means freedom and equality and dignity for the Palestinians as much as it for the Israelis, I got no problem with Zionism. I have somebody to tell me that. No one has ever told me that that's what Zionism means.
For what's worth, I have Israeli friends that are that consider themselves anti-Zionist insofar as it's not that they don't believe that the state of Israel ought to exist, but they are vehemently opposed to a ethno-nationalist conception of what that state would be, insofar as it is premised upon the subjugation of another population. And so kind of what you're getting at, Laith, is what might a one-state solution look like where everybody's living there, but they all have equal rights. And that's a challenge that the Israeli state is unable to grapple with.
Let me interrupt for one moment. We had a question from, and I don't remember the name, but the question was, can you quickly cite a time when your voice made a difference? That's one. And then second, what did we miss in this discussion?
A lot.
I hear.
Well, just real quick, in terms of like when have you felt your voice made a difference? Obviously, your voice makes a difference in smaller communities. I wrote a memo last year, and it caught the attention of the president of our university, and something changed, and that's good, right? Granted, it wasn't. There are times people write op-eds, and I'm influenced. That's good. That's a good thing, right? I hear a perspective I had not heard before. I'm enlightened, right? So those are all instances where people's voices matter.
You know, in all my years of teaching, which I don't do anymore, but I felt that those were valuable years in cultivating cultural literacy and educating, you know, people that would be making decisions. You know, Scott and I have known each other for years, and there's been times where he's influenced my view of things, and I'm grateful for it. This obviously the same with Aminah. So yeah, we just have to continue to speak our minds and say our piece. And I guess that's the moment when you're truly defeated, is when you refuse to speak your own mind. And maybe that is the one place where, you know, you truly have conceded and have been defeated. But I think if you're willing to continue to speak your mind, then you have hope and there's a chance. And I know I sound pessimistic because I am, just too much years of experience. But, you know, unless we can't stop speaking our minds, we have to. There's a certain place where we're not going to go past it, and one of them is speaking my mind. And I appreciate those who have continued to do that with me over the years, and I've learned a lot from them.
Mariam?
Well, I guess speaking, I guess, and you know, just talking to people one-on-one, just having those interpersonal interactions, making sure that you have the connections to, you know, to friends, to neighbors, to just people in your class, and I find that those are the places in which you make the most meaningful changes in people's minds, because they know you, whether it's for your fellow students or for your teachers as well. You might show them something that they didn't know about. I do remember a point where we made a presentation about the Uyghur Muslims, and most of our class was, you know, shocked because they just never knew about it. And, you know, coming up to me afterwards and being like, okay, you know, what does this mean for like products that come from China? So what does this mean for, you know, the just geopolitical climate? Even things, since it's a majority African American, they're like, you know, people talk about, oh, where we get our hair braided, where's this hair coming from? You know, that's one of the things we talked about. You know, just people just don't know, and when you help them understand in a way that's not patronizing, in a way that's not trying to belittle them for not knowing, basically, you know, one of the things I was going to ask if, you know, about anti-Semitism, like cheapening the term by using it so broadly, basically, and teaching someone what some like anti-Semitism, you know, actually is defined as and what it means. You know, that's a moment that you can also do like on that personal level. So that's when I felt my voice was heard and that a difference was made.
You know, if I could just say one thing about the anti-Semitism. There was a reason why I stuck with Zionism as an example. If you're anti-Zionist, you're an anti-Semite. I am cautious about telling people what real racism is. If they feel it, all of us have minorities, right? We've felt that, you know, that's a little racist. There's something about your worldview or something about what you're telling me. It's a little racist. I feel it. Now, there's been times where I've been restrained about expressing it because I feel like I don't think the person I'm talking to realizes it. But I think let me get to brass tacks again. I think there are times where a Jewish person may feel like something is anti-Semitism, where the person expressing what that thing is genuinely doesn't feel they're being anti-Semitic. So I do like to be somewhat cautious and telling people what racism is. I think everybody feels their own sensitivities. So when it comes to the term anti-Semitism, you know, when it comes to the way we talk about racism in certain circles in the United States, I find it to be a very complicated topic to talk about. It's very complex because it involves emotions, it involves perceptions. That's why I like to remain with a threshold where somebody is denying me my rights. And then Zionism is a denial of people's rights. So I like to remain clear when it comes to that. When we get into the murky waters of what actually qualifies as racist, I consider those waters murky and keep my toes out of them.
Abdullah.
No, what I would add to this is, I mean, experiences just like this evening's discussion. I think anytime we have an opportunity to share thoughts is a moment, if at one level, to reinforce or sometimes validate your feelings or attitudes or beliefs, or maybe bring them better into focus. And so that, I think there's plenty of opportunities where everybody has a chance to, make a difference. We never know. Sometimes the fact that we may not witness it, the change or something for good personally, doesn't mean that it has not occurred. Oftentimes something that is said or done may take years to germinate before that person may realize the truth of information that's been shared with them. So I think a much more broader view of ideas of when we're making a difference. It's not just when it's acknowledged publicly.
Kamila.
So my only comment is that when we experience so much grief, we tend to look to our faith for answers. We go to our institutions, our religious institutions, for guidance and answers. And I think it's really important that our leaders in our mosque, our masajid, our communities really align themselves with educators and organizations who are doing the work to inform us about what's really going on, so that we can get information, not to take away from our grief, but so that we can make educated decisions about what's causing our grief and our sadness watching this conflict unfold.
I want to thank all of you and all of those listening. The few people who were brave enough to send us some questions, please keep them coming. I'm going to ask all the guests to please stay on after we close. This is Professor Aminah Al-Deen. This has been a Critical Talk classroom. We can have more of these. If you think that it serves community knowledge, please let us know. Critical Talk is a program of Sound Vision. We're on YouTube, we're on Roku, we're in a lot of different places. Please visit with us on Mondays, 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Assalamu alaikum.